Prowess finally won an event, and now it's banned. Actually, the whole format is now banned. What the hell should you play? Find out coming up next. Well, the Magic Spotlight Series Final Fantasy came and went in Chiba, Japan this past weekend, one of the largest turnouts for a Magic event that I can personally remember, with 2,248 registered players in the main event, getting their first chance to play with Final Fantasy, and their last hurrah of Standard before the ban announcement that was made today, Monday, June 30th, when I'm recording this video. So with so many cards forcibly rotated from the format, there's not a ton to gain from going over the event in as much detail and in the way that I normally do. But I do think being able to reflect on the power level of the decks and how the format may evolve is worth exploring. So for this video, we'll hit on the same topics that I normally do in my event recap, but in slightly different ways with a little bit extra towards the end as well. We'll take a look at the metagame as a whole and what was at the event, looking to highlight any archetypes that could be worth checking out in a post-ban standard format. Then we'll still take a look at popularity to showcase just how much of the room was playing the top decks at such a massive event, and seeing if any of these decks that we wanted to look out for kind of compared to them in popularity ranking at all. Then we'll focus down on the top 10 win rate decks regardless of how popular they were at the MSS. Even though sample size will be small, this could be a springboard for ideas in a post-ban standard format. And then we'll take a step back and we will still look at the most played decks to learn how to tackle the overall head-to-head matchups into some of these surviving decks and which ones were actually already favored against the current meta and maybe a little overtuned because of it. Now, finally, I'm going to be hand-picking a couple of archetypes to talk about in a little bit more detail that I think will be well-positioned in the post-rotation standard format, as well as how they performed against other decks that I anticipate sticking around. So these are going to be decks that not only look really good for like the next 30 days or so, but will be surviving post-rotation or only need a couple of tweaks like maybe some lands or a card or two that already have some decent replacements ready. Now, as always, we need to talk about the data, specifically where it comes from and how it's going to be used. This event was hosted by Melee Platform, but deck lists were not available until early Monday morning and only for the paired matches. However, mtgdecks.net did have the list populated when the event ended, but these two have different names for the different lists. So I've combined the two resources to source round by round deck lists based on player names, hoping that everything matches up correctly. I did actually find one instance where a player had the same name as another player and played a different deck, and because of the way they matched up, Melee usually has pronouns and everything attached to it, MTG Decks does not, so it was registering the same player twice, and I fixed errors like that, thankfully. So all 2,248 players have painstakingly been matched with their deck lists between the two platforms. Well, besides a couple of troll lists that probably entered for that sick cloud promo. Now, this event did have a handful of only lands list, but also had some players that literally just threw decks together with their favorite Final Fantasy characters in them. Now, some of these wound up playing multiple rounds, while others immediately forfeited their matches and dropped shortly afterwards. Now, I have not counted those forfeits in the overall records of any decks, and I've also taken the liberty of going through all of the lists that were labeled things like Dimir, Mardu, or Wooburg, and broke them down into their actual relevant archetypes based on the cards that were in them. Likewise, I've converted a few names of archetypes into things that are going to be more commonly referred to. So, namely, the blank guild enchantments or blank shard enchantments lists are going to be referred to as their color identity, and then Yuna, because it's a Yuna Hope of Spira deck overall. And similar to my other recap videos, we're just looking at the Swiss rounds. Buys do not count, ties do. And so with all of that out of the way, we should have everything we need to dive into the data. All right, so looking at the big picture, and I do mean big because there were 189 different deck archetypes in Chiba after I cleaned them up, there's a lot to unpack here. For starters, 96 of the deck archetypes only had one copy at the MSS, which accounts for 50.8% of the different types of decks there. But this includes all the actual archetypes people played, as well as things like mono black Final Fantasy cards, my favorite, that people put together just to get promos or play a single round with their favorite characters. Now, the 2-copy deck archetypes are where you should even start looking as far as potential decks go, with 31 different archetypes being played by a duo of pilots for a 16.4% share of the metagame. Now, here we see decks that have already existed, such as Abzan Pixie, Mono White Life Gain, Orzhov Aristocrats, and Rakdos Lizards, probably prepping for that sick Laughing Jasper Flint promo. But we've seen some pretty interesting decks, like Gruul Dinosaurs of all things, a plethora of mono-colored aggro shells, and 4-color Yuna, as well as 5-color Legends, the combo deck Lupin Relic of Legends activations. Now, 9.5% of the metagame was playing an archetype with at least 3 copies in the room, with Boros Monument, Dimir Bounce, and Simic Terror as archetypes you might recognize, at least for the time being, while Selesnya and Naya Beanstalk, different than Yuna decks, Rakdos Demons in Standard of all places, and a personal favorite of mine, Mono Black Discard, all fall into this category. Now, there are also 11 archetypes that had 4 pilots opt into playing them, with Esper Pixie, Jeskai Convoke, and Selesnya Cage being among the most recognizable. Decks to keep an eye on, though, include the Gruul Chocobo deck, revolving around landfall as a mechanic for some aggressive starts, and the 5-color Human Legends deck, curving from Cecil up to Jeru and Hazaret. Now, only one deck, Dimir Midrange, had 5 different pilots in the room, while 2 archetypes, if you don't count the only lands lists, had 6 copies in the room. 2 flavors of Rakdos between Midrange and Aggro had 7 copies, 2 different Boros decks, as well as Orzhov Sacrifice had 8 copies, and 2 versions of Gruul decks. Good things come in pairs when it comes to dual colors. A list with Leyline Resonance and without Leyline Resonance sported 9 copies in the room. Now, the remaining deck archetypes had a double-digit number of pilots playing at the Spotlight series, making up just 11.6% of the metagame share. Although, 3 of these decks made up 50% of the decks in the room. Alright, well, I will admit now that the popularity tier is not as important for this recap because we're not going to be having the same kinds of decks present at your LGS or your online metagames anymore because most of them are bound in the banhammer. However, these are groupings based on how many of these different decks were played at the event to showcase not only the power within a tier to see how these decks are playing against one another, but also looking at the popularity compared to the different tiers of decks to see how successful certain decks are and who is picking up on what kind of combated each other in the metagame. S tier got pretty crowded at the Spotlight series, with Prowess and Mono Red making up just shy of 1,000 of the decks being played, while Azorius Omniscience brought that total to just over half the room playing one of these 3 decks. Guess when you look at it from a pure decks in the room standpoint, a lot of people would be glad to never see these 3 again. But when you focus on win rates for the decks, it's clear that the metagame as a whole was adapting, especially to Prowess's top spot, quite well. As for a second event in a row, the deck fell to below an average of 50% win rate on the event, despite winning its first and last major event. Meanwhile, Mono Red also fell from its absurd win rate to a more quote-unquote reasonable one at 52.9% on average, as the number of decks in the room and the relative skill level of players at the event was much different than last week's Pro Tour, but still very good overall. Now, Azorius Omniscience kept up its above 52.5% win rate on the weekend and had a larger number of decks, but a smaller share of the metagame overall, as red decks took up a lot of that space they were occupying. Now, since all 3 of these decks were hit by bans this morning, there isn't much use dwelling on how to prepare to face these decks, but it's clear that as Prowess decks got targeted harder and harder, the other decks that were popular only got stronger as things went on. Now, no A tier due to the size of the event and the fact that half the room was on one of the S tier decks. Instead, we have a larger B tier of decks, including one of the biggest winners from the ban announcement, rocking the second highest win rate of these popularity tier decks, Dimir Midrange. Kaito, Vren, and the rest of the Tempo Midrange gang climbed up to a 54.2% win rate overall, in addition to being the 4th most played deck at the MSS. The popularity, at least, was something I predicted in my earlier video due to the archetype's historic popularity in Japan. But the deck put up results and not just numbers, proving it had something figured out to fight against the top decks. Now, Domain also had a large number of pilots, just 2 less than Dimir did, but did not have quite the same results. The deck crushing on Up the Beanstalk as its engine is all but gone from the format, with Zur and Leyline Binding also leaving come Edge of Eternity's release, but may still have a home for its Overlords in the Yuna list that we'll talk about later on. Golgari Roots is taking its farewell tour of the format strong as well, with a 53.9% average win rate and a second straight strong performance, even though the deck will lose Tyvar, Glissa, and a couple of key cards in that deck. Meanwhile, Gruul Delirium picked up not just popularity, but average win rate as well. 50.7% on the weekend is just above average for a deck that was pretty hot and cold all standard RC season. Now, the Gruul deck that wants different card types in the graveyard is also in a decent position come rotation, as it's not really losing out on anything main deck and gaining a shock land to help out the mana base. C tier has a whole mess of decks. Anything with 12 copies or more, until you hit the B tier, can be found here in this area of the metagame, where I think you'll see people navigating to in the quote-unquote garbage time of standard between now and rotation, which will bring in the new RCQ season. Basically, this is just experimentation time to figure out what you think is going to work and identifying what decks may live post-rotation. Now, some of these decks have floated around for a while now, like Abzan Pixie, Azorius Control, and the Demons lists. Meanwhile, some newcomers, like the Izzet Cauldron deck, debuted just a week ago by PvDDR at the Pro Tour, as well as the Naya Yuna shell pop up in this tier. Now, as far as the control shells go, though, both Orzhov and Azorius had it rough in Japan with below average win rates. Azorius feeling it the most after having a really good head-to-head into Prowess the last few weeks of play. Meanwhile, the Izzet Cauldron deck, which, by the way, lost nothing in the wake of today's colossal ban announcement, put up the highest average win rate at the tournament for these popularity tier decks at 58.3%. Pumping out mana for days by making everything with counters on it into a Vivi is pretty safe for the time being. Although it loses Thrillseeker as a way to win the game, will instead have to rely on the normal combat, FOMO making another attack step for its largest threat. Now, the Naya Yuna shell is a debut deck for this event, averaging a 52.7% win rate overall in a much better performance than the relative Domain deck a lot of players compare it to. Although they share a card type they care about, we'll dive into what makes the Yuna deck truly tick later on, as the deck will basically be at 100% power through bans and rotation. Now, other decks to keep an eye on are the Mono Black and Orzhov builds, ranging from Unholy Annex to straight grindy shells, with the White Splash continuing to put up better results than the mono-colored version, just shy of a break-even 50-50 win rate. Boros Burn, which will look to fight the top aggro spot in the format against some of these Gruul and Leyline based decks for the next coming weeks, was also close to that coveted 50% average win rate, although some shells will need to find replacements for the Heartfire heroes they have in there after this ban, and Monastery Swiftspear, which will not survive rotation. Now that we looked at what was popular, let's shift our focus to what was the most successful at the event, regardless of how popular it might have been. Now, a reminder for these win rate stats, sample size does matter. Remember that when looking at these decks, and that by me talking about them doing well in small amounts, I am not advocating for them as the best decks in the format. Just something that brewers and innovators alike may want to turn their attention towards. Additionally, this was a 2-day event with a draft portion. Even a 3-day event, but we're not looking at the knockout stage. So some of these decks may not have played a single match of standard on day 2 due to a poor overall record when combined with limited. So keep your eyes and ears open for when I mention that in these decks. Whew, somebody pinch me because I must be dreaming. Ow! Okay, maybe not that hard. A Golgari Obliterator deck was not only the highest win rate deck at the Spotlight series, but the deck has Dark Confidant and Cecil Dark Knight in it. I think I may have just died and gone to Magic Tom heaven with this list. Now, the list itself is pretty no-nonsense, with 4 ofs across the board between the aforementioned creatures, Monster Dread Knight, Karsi Revenant, and Sheoldred. Bushwhack and Tail Swipe as the main ways for Obliterator to get down and dirty by forcing damage to make opponents sacrifice their stuff. It does get an upgrade post-combat if Cecil has already flipped into his redeemed Paladin form and given said Obliterator indestructible for the turn. And before that, Cecil and Karsi Revenant both perform amazingly with the fight spells and Death Touch combination. Honestly, I just love this deck from a pure card standpoint, but I can't suggest buying into it when the namesake card, Sheoldred, and one of the fight spells all rotate soon. I'm just going to be jamming this one online for like the next couple weeks, don't mind me. Abzan Pixie had 2 decks at the tournament, but was heavily carried by one pilot going 11, 1, and 3 overall. The deck utilized Nurturing Pixie and Sunpeel Curran to, of course, bounce the now banned Hopeless Nightmare, but also use Severance Priest and Skirmish Rhino to control the opponent's hand and drain some damage separately. Now, Bob, the Dark Confidant, found a home in this shell as well, as the largest mana cost threat was a singleton Sheoldred. However, this deck not only lost its most consistent bounce target, but will also lose Go for the Throw and Terra Sunder, 2 of the main removal spells that it wound up running with the oncoming rotation. Now, while you probably can find some replacement cards for those removal spells, the versatility of a card like Terra Sunder is going to be difficult to match at instant speed, even though you can kind of compromise on a 3-mana sorcery speed version with Maelstrom Pulse. Although it destroys instead of exiles, it does better work against like a bunch of token decks, as you're going to be getting rid of all the different copies of those things. But in addition to that, Tiny Bones Joins Up is still legal, but will not wind up giving you the extra drain damage the way that Hopeless Nightmare will, which means that this deck is going to have to get in dirty on the ground a little bit more in order to be effective. Grixis Oculus here is honestly a bit of a stretch in the 60% win rate slot, as the pilot of the deck dropped from the event after going 3-2, I guess cosplaying Jerry T. However, the deck has a few things going for it, as the normal abhorrent Oculus Steam's Core Scholar Prophydetic Memory package is joined by the package of Black Hand Disruption and Creature Destruction. Harvester of Misery is another good card to pitch as early removal, while No One Left Behind is the reanimation spell of choice, which gets back Oculus for the same cost as Recommission, but has the ability to reanimate larger things like Harvester in the late game, which will then wipe a board. But a lot of these cards I just mentioned rotate. Namely, all the black ones not named Harvester of Misery. So this deck is like a one and done event special. It's not long for the format. If you're craving more eyeball decks, check out Jeskai Monument. That doesn't sound right, but the deck's pilot basically took some of the Boros Monument deck and smashed it together with, well, just Oculus to be fair. The Draw Discard package got an upgrade with Joshua Phoenix's Dominant from the new Final Fantasy set, and Guardian of New Benalia is still a house for the deck to keep discarding cards. But with Guardian and Recommission and Phyrexian Dragon Engine all rotating soon, the deck may have to rely harder on the Oculus side, with Call a Surprise Witness staying from this list specifically, and Helping Hand being something that the deck can add to give it a little bit more of that recursive angle. Jeskai Prowess won't see the same amount of play after this thanks to the Corey Steelcutter ban, but for the event, the list had some interesting tech from the White Splash to combat both cutter decks and its #1 opposition in High Noon. Requisition Raid, a spree spell that allowed for the deck to choose both parts of Disenchant, made the cut as a main deck counter hate card, while Lightning Helix and Rediscover the Way added to the damage pushing and card finding capabilities that Burst Lightning and Stock Up normally afford the deck. Honestly, I would have loved to see this version of the deck evolve more if the metagame stayed Prowess cutter heavy, but with all the bans, we're never gonna know. Abzan Reanimator is a graveyard-based deck with multiple ways to bring its heavy hitters back to the battlefield, including Yuna, Hope of Spira. Now, unlike other versions of Yuna decks that want to run discard draw spells and play a slightly lower curve to do so, this version of the deck uses Overlord of the Baelmerk and Dredger's Insight to mill the cards straight from the deck, using Zombify as another way to get things into play. As far as what we're bringing back, well, Yuna is a summoner, so it'll make sense to pack plenty of thematic summons in the deck, from Knights of the Round to Primal Odin, capping at Bahamut to really close out a game. Now, if those aren't what you need, you've still got the Overlord package as they hold over from domain decks that were
perfectly with Yuna as well. Virtue of Persistence is a wild card to hit on a mill, being brought back with Yuna and then also bringing back the best creature in any graveyard every turn. Izzet Cauldron had another standout performance, this time in the hands of many more pilots at the MSS. Now, the ability to turn a bunch of creatures into Vivi clones by just placing a +1/+1 counter pop right on top of them makes for explosive turns that can take an opponent from 20 to GG as early as turn 3. We actually saw that on camera in some of the final rounds, I think the quarterfinals of the MSS. Now, Winter Night Stories is the key piece to keep digging through the deck, as Harmonize, the part of the card that's the ability from the graveyard, allows for a virtual 8 copies to be played, while Prof's Eidetic Memory can add counters to an unactivated creature every time you use it. So, Voldarian Thrillseeker is still there to win most games, as you need to go through combat to use Prof's counters, but in a post-rotation world, this deck will either need combat steps or a fling effect to achieve the same results, not just with the ability to stick it under a cauldron. A version with a slight twist from the other mid-range style of decks, Orzhov Demons didn't have any actual demons in the deck, but still packed a full 4 of Unholy Annex with 4 Soulstone Sanctuary to keep itself from just taking too much damage. Now, it also leveraged Zoraline Cosmos Caller to not just balance its life total, but recur the card advantage engine alongside creatures that are forces to be reckoned with on the battlefield, such as Karsi Revenant and Preacher of the Schism. Now, while the deck looks set up for success, a lot does actually leave the format soon. From Sheoldred to, well, the entire black removal package, meaning the deck will need to find replacements in order to properly survive a rotation. An old favorite combo deck got some new life with a plethora of legendary creatures in Final Fantasy, as 5-color Legends combo has an abundance of 1 to 3 mana legendary humans to warrant Cavern of Souls and Plaza of Heroes. Now, Relic of Legends allows Rona, Herald of Invasion, to tap for mana and then untap with a legend to do it all over again. Using this mana combo with a pair of Honest Rutstein, you can tap the Outlaw for mana and, alongside Rona, cast a duplicate from your hand. Keep the untapped one as your legendary rule state-based action, and then return the freshly killed one to your hand with the new one's ETB, giving you infinite casts and, most importantly, infinite dies triggers. So instead of needing Tiny Bones Joins Up, Sephiroth Fabled Soldier gives us the outlet to drain our opponents, eventually giving us an emblem that opponents can't even interact with. The downside, Rona and Relic rotate, so get your combos in while you can. This final list is labeled as 4-color control and has a single black mana pip and its 1 copy of Inevitable Defeat to justify itself. But in reality, it's a pretty all over the place Jeskai control shell using, and I'm sorry I didn't look this up before, Ohir Pakpatik instead of Shiko as its recursive engine, giving all of its spells rebound. Now this combines with Ral, Crackling Wit, to eventually get their spells to all have Storm as well, meaning said Inevitable Defeat can exile an entire board or end the game, while Lightning Helix is the main way the deck has to win. Experimental Augury is the card draw spell of choice that can proliferate the package of Planeswalkers from Ral, giving it actually 2 counters, to Quintorius Canned, and Ugin, Eye of Storms, while a normal board wipe and counterspell package for most Azorius or Jeskai flavored control decks keeps other decks at bay. Now, I'm not going to lie, I'm a little lost on this one, and it did only play 9 total rounds, so I'm not even sure this is something worth looking into, especially when cards like its Proliferate Engine rotate soon. So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head-to-head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering, online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others. especially compared to the Prowess deck. So this is more of a general guideline as to how a matchup may go rather than a be-all, end-all type of stack ranking. Okay, so these are going to be a little off the cuff. I didn't write anything down for it, but Izzet Prowess, the win rate is plummeting and the decks against it are getting better and better. Mono red aggro, still a great win rate. Azorius Omniscience getting slightly better. Dimir Midrange picking it apart. Even the domain Overlords deck is beating up on Prowess at this event. Now, towards the end of the little breakdown of the different decks here, the decks that originally were really good against it weren't this event, so it's a little bit of a weird kind of role reversal here, as the last hurrah of Izzet Prowess actually saw it taking down its biggest opposition in Azorius Control, Orzhov Pixie, and Mono Black Demons, with 55.4% win rate being the lowest of those three matches. But all the other decks in the room were gunning for Prowess, and pretty glad it's gonna be gone. Speaking of glad that things are gone, Mono Red Aggro still had a really solid win rate this event. Now, the one deck that it did struggle a little bit more against at this event compared to the Pro Tour or events previously was the Azorius Omniscience deck, 46.9% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. Meanwhile, it actually struggled against the Gruul Delirium deck, which did have some bigger things on the ground a little bit earlier and potentially could just kind of stifle what Mono Red was trying to do if it didn't draw that pesky Monstrous Rage card. Now, Orzhov Pixie still had a very good matchup against it, as did the Mono Black Demons deck, as a lot more Anoint with Afflictions were running around this time around, especially with VV being a thing that you probably don't want to put in people's graveyards at this point in time. But the Mono Red deck still had a bunch of high win rates, specifically against the slower decks like Dimir Midrange and Domains or Overlords, and was still beating up on the Golgari Roots deck even when it was a little bit more of a fair package. So Heartfire Hero, Monstrous Rage, they're gone from the format. I honestly think that Mono Red is going to have to go through a big evolution in order to really be a contender in the format, probably switching back to Gruul. Maybe we're looking at Delirium. Either way, this was the last hurrah, but it was an impressive performance for the mouse package. All right, I can't be the only one that didn't expect Azorius Omniscience to not be a deck after this event, but Azorius Omniscience had a very good performance, especially against the top decks in the room. The only head-to-head matchup it had a losing record in was against the Dimir Midrange deck. So if you were to take all of the data and ignore it and just put this microcosm of this event into the picture, it makes a lot of sense to have Azorius Omniscience get something banned away during this massive ban announcement. The Dimir deck, relatively untouched, would have basically been its biggest opposition, and then you would have had to look at, okay, what beats the Dimir deck, and you would have had another kind of 1, 2, 3 microcosm of the metagame. So with Azorius Omniscience on its way out the door, you're probably going to see pilots shift between a couple of different shells. Maybe you try out a Bant Yuna shell to try to get Omniscience on the battlefield and do the Meringue River region thing if you're able to untap, which seems pretty difficult. Or maybe you just shift towards Azorius Control or Jeskai Control, and you wind up taking elements from the Omniscience deck in order to make those decks a little better against the rest of the field. Oh, speaking of Dimir Midrange, here it is. So we could see what decks would have beat up on it. Well, Domain rotates, and that had a above 50% win rate against the Dimir Midrange deck. Golgari Roots, that rotates. That had a 60% win rate, as Dimir has the 40% in that head-to-head matchup. And Mono Red Aggro, which is gone because the mouse package is banned. Okay, Dimir Midrange was looking really, really good in this format, as Omniscience is also gone. So there's going to be some big changes to the standard format, but Dimir Midrange, alongside the Izzet Cauldron deck, are probably the two decks that are going to stick out in the first couple of days of the new format as the decks to beat. Look at its win rate against the remaining couple of decks, even though the sample size isn't super huge. Positive win rate against Delirium, which might be the go-to aggro deck right now. Positive win rate against the control decks here, which means that this mid-range shell with Hand Disruption is doing something good, and Kaito is still a pain for these decks. And then straight up winning record into the Mono Black Demons, a mid-range mirror matchup, meaning that what Dimir is doing with its tempo plan is stifling down on things that want to run Archfiend to the draws, like we're back in the Esper Pixie days. So Dimir Midrange, this is where you want to be if you're playing a Black X deck in the post-rotation format, assuming that Cut Down's loss is not the biggest thing in the world, and replacements for Go for the Throat or Anoint with Affliction like Shoot the Sheriff and Bitter Triumph are still super good for the deck to run. All right, Domain Overlords is out the door, and I don't think there's a ton of comparisons between Domain and the Yuna decks that we'll talk about a little bit later on to really garner anything from these overall win rate statistics. But the one thing I do want to point out is that in the combination of Authority of the Consuls and High Noons, that the Domain deck was able to get the upper hand in the Izzet Prowess matchup in the last kind of head-to-head we're going to see between these two decks in the standard format. However, its glaring weakness to aggro decks and combo decks was making this deck absolutely painful for pilots to continue to power through with. Now, it did wind up having a better win rate against the control decks and even the mono black mid-range deck towards the end of these little rankings in win rates here, but the Domain deck loses Zur, loses Leyline Binding, and most importantly, Up the Beanstalk is up and out of here, which means that this deck, even if something of the shells survived, it needs to be completely rebuilt, and that's where we start looking at Yuna. Golgari Roots had a good win rate against Prowess and was fairly close to even against Mono Red Aggro and the Azorius Omniscience deck, and then looking at its spread of matches against the rest of the field, specifically Gruul Delirium, which I guess is never getting Delirium against a deck running Agatha's Soul Cauldron and Scavenging Ooze, and maybe even Keen-Eye Curator, 90.9% win rate in that head-to-head is an absurd win rate there. But regardless of how good Roots is looking right now, get your licks in while you can, because Tyvar, Glissa, and a couple of other things like Haywire Might are all rotating come Edge of Eternities. So this Gruul Insidious Roots package, while you still wind up having Insidious Roots and Scavenging Ooze, you don't have Tyvar to make those plans immediately tap for mana. And if you're looking at some of the sideboard plans or going for the quote-unquote Jund version, you do not have Voldaren Thrillseeker to actually just straight up win you the game later down the line. So Roots is probably going to pivot more into a fair Golgari graveyard mid-range shell, and I don't even know if Roots is going to be a part of that package anymore. Oh, speaking of the deck that Roots beat up on, Gruul Delirium had a pretty solid win rate against the top two aggro decks in the room and was competitive but slightly unfavored against the Azorius Omniscience deck. Now, competitive but slightly unfavored is probably still okay against the third most played deck in the room, and then when you go down to the fourth most played with Dimir, it starts to look a little dicey, but you pick up again against Domain Zur, and then you kind of fall down to Roots. But looking at what the Gruul Delirium deck was beating up on, it was beating up on all the decks that rotate. So I'm not sure where the Gruul Delirium deck is going to go from here. I don't really know if there's a ton of wiggle room in the creature package or the interaction or the spells that it's running. This may wind up being something that was like a specific target towards Mono Red and Izzet that wound up paying off. And with Domain going out the door as well, Roots sticking around for a couple of more weeks, I don't really know if this is going to be a shell that pops up again until after the first post-rotation results come in. Azorius Control did not have as good of a weekend as I thought it was going to, and part of that you can see right here is because it did not have as good of a head-to-head against the Izzet Prowess matchup as it did at the last two competitive events. As in, it had a losing record, actually, whereas it was by and far 70% or higher favorite against the Izzet Prowess deck and like 80-something% at the Pro Tour specifically. So it could be quality of pilot, it could be configuration of the deck, but whatever it is, Azorius Control was not the Prowess killer that everybody thought it was going to be. That did gain some matchup percentage points against Mono Red Aggro, but that went from like 30-something% to still slightly below 50%, so even though it's close to even, it did not make up for all the points that it lost in the Prowess head-to-head. And it still wound up struggling against the mid-range decks, the combo decks, and everything else that wasn't playing a Prowess or aggro game plan. So Azorius Control, while it's not necessarily losing a ton of things, especially if aggro is not as present anymore and you don't have to run temporary lockdowns, you don't have Sunfall, you have to play Ultima, the deck's at a very interesting spot, and come the first couple of weeks of post-rotation standard, I do not expect the deck to be very present or very successful. But once we start seeing what is at the top of the metagame again, like if it's the Izzet Cauldron deck and you're still able to run main deck High Noon or Authority of the Consuls, so you can't actually tap to activate Harmonize, Azorius Control will have those silver bullet cards tech their deck against the top stages of the meta and hopefully raise their win rate up alongside it. So Orzhov Pixie is going to have to pivot a lot because it's losing Hopeless Nightmare, so it's losing its best hand disruption and clock, which means that this version of the control style tempo deck is probably not long for this world, even though some of its spells lived through rotation. Now, it did not have a great prowess matchup at the MSS, but did pick up again against Mono Red, having an almost 60% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. The downside was, of course, Orzhov Pixie causing people to discard cards. Not the greatest when you can just get your opponent to discard their Omniscience on turn 1, and you need to be able to get it out of their graveyard before they just straight up beat you. Dimir Midrange was also a difficult matchup for the Pixie deck to control against because they had their own disruptive elements and weren't playing as to the board and could just hold a bunch of cards in hand if they got an Enduring Curiosity on the battlefield, make it very difficult to even control their tempo. Now, against the rest of the field, it looked not that great. Gruul Delirium had a winning matchup into because that's more of an aggro deck again, and surprisingly against the Mono Black Demons deck, although it struggled against Dimir, it seems to be okay against the Demons deck. May just wind up being something along the lines of the Dimir Midrange deck having more kind of incidental 1/1 flyers and stuff hanging around versus the Mono Black deck that probably just has like one Haymaker and maybe something else like a Preacher, which is still very relevant and difficult to deal with if you're looping out sacrifice effects and stuff. And speaking of that Mono Black Demons deck, this is going to be something that people are looking at in the immediate post-ban standard, but probably not something in post-rotation standard unless we get a lot of really good 1 mana black or 2 mana black, just like disruption and destroy type cut down replacements, right? One of the big additions to some of the black based mid-range shells and even some of the Mono Black Demon sideboards was Cruel Claw's Heist to try to make it better into the control and combo matchups or the mid-range mirrors. It didn't pan out for the Dimir deck in this event, the Mono Black deck in this event as a whole, as you can look at this list and see that the only favorable matchup it really had was against the Mono Red aggro deck, which will no longer exist. So much like the control shells, the Mono Black Demons deck is going to have to go back to the drawing board, see what creatures and interaction spells it can package to attack the upcoming shifts in the metagame. Breaking up the sea of card pictures with my face for a second, I am going to be hopping into this section of decks to watch out for in a post-rotation standard environment. Now, these are going to be decks that were present here at the Magic Spotlight series, have actual results, and have head-to-head matchup statistics that I can kind of reference to figure out what may or may not be well-positioned going into the next couple of months of standard without really knowing what's coming out in Edge of Eternities. So these lists are mostly going to be looking at some of their win rate data from this Magic Spotlight series, going back a couple events to see how the decks have been performing in the regional championship and Pro Tour scene this past season in general, and then also looking at the cards that are in the list and trying to select things that are as rotation proof as possible. So things that are using new cards from Final Fantasy, things that are using cards from the most recent sets like Aether Drift, as well as looking at decks where the cards that are rotating from them have an almost one-to-one replacement or something that I feel like can take that role extremely well. So without further ado, I'm going to list off a few different decks that I think you should look at in a post-rotation standard world. Izzet Cauldron is the de facto best deck in the format for the time being. Now, why am I so confident in saying that? Well, the deck is pretty much a combo version of the Prowess shell that just lost its main win condition without any of these cards being taken away from this BNR. Now, what the deck lacks in Cutter Go Wide, it has an Astrologian's Planisphere to make extremely large creatures, thanks to a bunch of +1/+1 counters going on them, while being able to keep that cycle of spellcasting available thanks to Agatha's Soul Cauldron with a VV underneath it. Now, each Planisphered creature, every Marauding Mako that grows with the draw discard effects, and any FOMOs or VVs themselves that get counters from the Soul Cauldron can keep fueling the fire of this deck. Now, it's very streamlined, packs spaces for interactive spells that can be interchanged with shifts in the standard metagame, and has a way to win the game outside of combat damage with Voldaren Thrillseeker, which both adds counters and is amazing underneath a cauldron, turning all of your creatures into flingable ways to win the game. Now, while the deck does face Thrillseeker rotating, which means its main way to win with the cauldron is leaving the format, Being able to draw through your deck thanks to Winter Night Stories will make it easy enough to swap out for any number of fling effects like the Final Fantasy card Self-Destruct. Now the deck is still vulnerable, however, as the right mix of removal plus graveyard hate can cause issues if a VV can't get cauldroned or stay in play, while the prowess stopping cards like High Noon work just as well, if not better, against this version of the deck. Now, despite all of these weaknesses that are being played against it, the deck still had a 58.3% average win rate this weekend in the hands of pilots much less accomplished than PVDDR himself. Dimir Midrange is the other clear winner from not just the results of this tournament, but also the ban announcement. Dimir's biggest weakness right now is that there are a few different versions that seem to be performing well. So it might take a little bit of gameplay in order to figure out which of the quote-unquote best version might be, but there's still a list in top 8 of this MSS that we can look at as an example. Now, low-cost disruptive creatures and evasive threats clear the way for Kaito Bane of Nightmares to drown them in card advantage and lockdown, while Enduring Curiosity, well, it keeps that card draw going and the tempo high, keeping your hand stocked and ready to go. This deck's latest additions give Scavenger Regent as the Exude Toxin part can wipe a board of small creatures, and in some lists, Vren the Relentless provides an exile effect, as well as a pseudo go wide angle with some extra rat tokens if you're killing opposing cards with your Vren in play. Now, Azure Beastbinder flips between main deck and sideboard, keeping down aggressive growing threats and giant things alike like the Overlords, with its unique ability being a great way to stick a Kaito into play as well. Now, the main cards that Dimir loses from rotation are the black removal spells, Cut Down being the most impactful, but less of an impact if aggro is not really an issue. We have Disfigure, we have Stab, we have Grim Bauble. And Underground River and Darkflick Shore's package of lands, that also gets kicked out the door. But Starting Town can slide in for River, while Watery Grave, which is already spoiled from Edge of Eternities, takes over for the fast land. So it hurts ourselves a tiny bit, but some of those lists running Seasonal Dark Knight in that one drop slot might like that. Naya Yuna is the deck that all the domain lovers out there are going to want to shift towards once rotation happens, as the deck is already going to leverage a lot of the lands, as well as some of the overlords the deck currently uses. Now, there are a few different versions of the deck, even within the Naya colors itself. So again, the quote-unquote best version is still up for debate. But when all of them combine for an average win rate of 52.7% this weekend, you know they're onto something good. Now, the top placing deck was a little lower to the ground, using Esper Origins, FOMO, and Joshua to fill the graveyard for Yuna to reanimate things, while Esper Origins could flip itself on a flashback to eventually overrun the board with enough FOMOs and Screaming Nemesi on their own, especially if you wind up having enough card types to get a second swing. Now, Overlord of the Boiler Bilges finally has its time to shine, as the Flame Tongue Kavu Inferno Titan sort of hybrid is one of the best things for Yuna to bring back from the graveyard, doming opponents, killing threats, and because of Yuna, gaining life while doing so. The Elder Dragon War is a saga that does rotate because it's pretty old at this point, but provides both a small creature board wipe and a discard outlet, not to mention a dragon token to come along with it. Now, overall, the deck is incredibly customizable spell, with the winning list not even running the Selesnya package of Overlords, while the deck itself is only losing the Elder Dragon War to rotation, which can be an issue or potentially replaced either with more Joshuas, a board wipe like Pyroclasm, or a discard outlet like Kickoff Celebration or Case of the Crimson Pulse, which both are enchantments. Okay, so the last deck I want to highlight as something to keep in mind now and leading up through rotation is a little bit of an older deck that may power up thanks to the rest of the format cooling down. Jeskai Oculus loses none of its core creatures or spell package to rotation, although it may be difficult to salvage the mana base. It keeps 2 of the 3 fast lands it currently has, while gaining Sacred Foundry, but because it's not the same color as Seachrome Coast, it may make the deck lean a little bit more to the Boros, and potentially maybe even pushing in like a Monument sideboard plan. But the deck has gotten a powerful new card in Joshua Phoenix's Dominant, and can also look at Lightning Army of 1 as a potential Boros replacement if the mana becomes too difficult. Joshua, Tursa, FOMO, and Steam's Core Scholar pair great with Inti and Pros Eidetic Memory, all of which stick around post-rotation, meaning that the deck can play a little more aggressively than the other graveyard-based decks. Now, decks usually run just Helping Hand, but Call a Surprise Witness exists as another tool to revive discarded creatures, and Flipping Joshua could bring back anywhere from 2 to 4 creatures in one go if a Marauding Mako is in the mix, giving the deck a late game plan that it can play towards. Now, this all sounds great in theory, but the deck is going to need some help from the shifting metagame around it. While a single pilot went 11-4-0 this weekend, others didn't do so hot and tanked the overall average win rate to an abysmal 42.8%.
So if you're as blindsided by the ban announcements as I was this morning, you can tell that there's a lot that has to go into the way that Standard is going to be looked at over the next couple of days or couple of weeks. Now, one thing is a little awkward about this is while a lot of people are excited about the fact that Standard looks really fresh, it's going to be very difficult for some players to actually invest themselves into the format over the next 30 days before there's rotation and you're going to wind up seeing another dramatic change in the metagame as to what's being played and why. So that's why I tried to highlight some of those lists for you so you can kind of look where to maybe pull your resources if you have a couple of cards that you still need to buy to finish one of these lists, or look at some lists that may wind up being okay even in a post-rotation Standard world. Now, this is going to be a little bit of like experimentation time if you're playing on Arena, specifically in Best of 1. It's gonna be really weird not having the mouse package pop up like every 2 out of 3 games or something like that, and it's also gonna be a little bit weirder playing on Magic the Gathering Online, especially for the first like week or 2 of leagues when people are still kind of feeling out the format. And I have a feeling there's gonna be a lot of VV Cauldron decks floating around, and then people still packing high noon packages, and people able to kind of abuse that with the mid-range decks that are coming in and able to attack the hand and graveyard of both of those style of decks. I've also seen a lot of streamers already picking up the Yuna decks and trying out different versions of them, from the Naya version that is a little bit more straightforward how it wants to do things, to the Abzan and Reanimator versions that are doing a whole bunch of different cool graveyard shenanigans, bringing things back like Virtue of Persistence, and we talked about it in the video already, so I don't need to go over it too much. But with all of these changes in Standard, first off, how do you feel about the bans? Because I was completely wrong on it. I wound up only hitting 1 out of like the 7 that wound up getting banned. So this format is completely unpredicted by what my means were. And I thought that we might have seen some of these bans coming in after Edge of Eternities when the format had rotated and if things didn't naturally adjust. So how are you feeling about post-rotation Standard? And are any of these deck lists from the Spotlight series something that you would be considering playing in the upcoming Standard RCQ season? Because we are going to be going from Modern to Standard when Edge of Eternities hits, the format rotates. It's going to be a fresh competitive environment. So get down in those comments below and let me know what you're looking forward to playing or what you're looking forward to not playing against anymore. While you're down there, you can of course give the video a thumbs up to show your support and let the YouTube algorithm gods know that they should not ban or rotate these recap videos from my channel or from your suggested feeds. Now, while you're down there, you can also feel free to click the join button down below or on the homepage of my channel to show your support by becoming a member to my channel. Members get a bunch of different types of benefits, ranging from early access to content, access to more of my written content and deck lists that I post on my members only YouTube posts, as well as getting Discord access to our members only Discord, where you can send over your deck list. You can talk to me about what you feel like is going to be going on post rotation, and we can chat all about Magic cards while I probably should be working. So if you want to wind up getting benefits like these fine folks over here, you can of course click that join button down below or on my channel homepage to show your devotion. And as always, I really hope you just tap that subscribe button, because that helps you stay up to date on all of my Magic the Gathering deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general gameplay content, whatever I'm going to wind up doing. There's a whole brand new format out there to try, and I still haven't even tapped into Pioneer since Final Fantasy. So we'll see you in the next video.